Mr. Emerald.
Members of the jury, we allege that for the 5 particular reasons, the particulars set out in the indictment, which you all have, I hope, the death penalty either perverts or has a tendency to pervert the course of justice. And we say that you can convict in this case on any one of those particulars. First, it infringes the right to life. It is a basic human right that should apply to all people worldwide, regardless of creed or nationality. Secondly, it amounts to a cruel and unusual punishment. These are the words in the American Constitution. Thirdly, the third particular, it risks the execution of innocent people. We say that there can be little doubt, but that innocent people have been executed, and the real question is, how many? The fourth particular is that it discriminates on grounds of race or poverty. The final particular is that the trial process is such that in many cases the defendant is placed at an unfair disadvantage. This overlaps, we say, with the last particular. It discriminates, does the death penalty, against the poor. There are too many cases where the trial lawyer is not competent enough or plain incompetent. For all these combined reasons, we say that these charges are proved.
With your lordship's leave, I propose to open this case to the jury. For members of the jury, tonight, the United States death penalty is on trial for perverting the course of justice. You're not being asked tonight to say whether the death penalty should be abolished or not. You're being asked to decide whether the death sentence in the United States is guilty of these offenses. The prosecution alleges racial bias in capital cases. What we hope to discover this evening, all of us, is if, and that's a big if there is any bias in capital cases, racial bias, then it may be that some of the experts can help us as to whether racial bias is peculiar to the death penalty or whether we find it right across the board. If you want to read the manual from that southern state in 1963, 50 years ago, fine. We're concerned with 2010. Of all the people executed since 1976, when the Supreme Court reallowed, that's my word, reallowed the death sentence, since 1976, a very small number of women have been executed, something like 11, if my memory serves me right. Does that mean that the death penalty is biased against men? Or putting it more simply, is it the simple fact that most murderers are men? Our position this evening is that the death penalty is not only lawful in the United States, but it should remain so. But, and it's a big but, only for the worst cases of murder. Thank you very much.
Professor, is it Julian Killingley? Are you a qualified solicitor and a professor of American public law at Birmingham City University School of Law?
I am.
To your mind, is there discrimination on the grounds of race in the United States in connection with capital cases?
Yes, race plays a significant effect in the administration of the death penalty within the United States.
There was what is now a well-known study by Professor Baldus and his team analyzing data to do with homicides in Georgia over a substantial period. Did it come to this conclusion that in Georgia the most significant factor was race, in particular the race of the victim? Does that surprise you?
Yes, it did, that defendants who killed white victims were more than 4 times as likely to receive the death sentence as those who killed black victims.
I want to turn to the question of the competence in broad terms of lawyers defending in capital cases. We've all seen dreadful examples of the behavior of some lawyers in some cases. What has been the attitude of the appellate courts to lawyers who are either incompetent or misbehave?
It might be said that in many low-level appeals, courts have consistently upheld convictions and failed to find fault with lawyers. Even egregious cases, such as lawyers falling asleep during the conduct of the case. The Bar Human Rights Committee in this country a few years ago sent a delegation to Texas, and the 2 counsel there witnessed a lawyer just abandoning his client in the middle of cross-examination by the district attorney, disappearing for a period of time, returning only to say, when asked where he had been, his car was on a parking meter. His client was being cross-examined by the district attorney and he wasn't even in the building.
Thank you. Just wait there, please.
You mentioned the study by, was it Professor Baldus? And the
Yes.
statistics you gave us, and we heard them all. When was that report?
It was performed in the 1980s, I believe.
Getting on for 30 years ago.
Yes.
You haven't referred to anything more recent,
There have been more
recent studies. Yes, but you haven't referred to them.
No,
Is there a reason for that?
no.
Just
Time.
time. Yes. Have you heard of the Rand Corporation report, as
Yes,
I
I
call
have.
it? Published in 2006.
Yes.
Anything you'd like to say about that?
No.
And I ask you again, if I may, why not?
Well, with almost any point of view that people care to adopt, there'll be other people who will come along and proffer contrary evidence.
Yes.
Yes, but there's no more reason to believe that the statisticians employed by the Rand Corporation had a better view than the professor of statistics who assisted Professor Baldus.
You've come here to give evidence, Professor Killingly, because you are an abolitionist. You want the death sentence abolished.
Yes.
Well, that's important. And so does it follow that this indictment, which this jury is considering this evening, whatever verdict they return, it won't change your views about the abolition of the death sentence?
The abolition of the death sentence
Could
is
I ask-
something... It won't change my view because it's founded simply upon, in my personal view, is that the state shouldn't do what it forbids its citizens to do.
We're all wasting our time here because it's not going to change your view.
I'm not a member of the jury.
No, you're not. This jury is not considering personal opinions, it's considering the evidence in support of this indictment. 2/3 of the population of the United States, one of the largest democratic countries, wish to have the death penalty. Do you have any view about that?
It's shared by more than 60% of the citizens of this country.
Yes, and look what happens when they vote. Thank you.
Kathy Harrington, please. Is your name Kathy Harrington?
Yes,
Was your daughter murdered in her home in 2004?
yes, sir.
I won't go into the association, but you were having, understandably, a very, very stressful time.
Yes, it was a nightmare, sir. I'm living every parent's worst nightmare.
Now, ultimately, were you asked for your views on whether the death sentence should be sought?
I didn't wait for them to ask, because the process that we were put through as a family of a murdered child, family member, was cruel, sir. We were held hostage to the system. My sons, who both wanted the death penalty for the murderer of their sister, initially, after 2 years of enduring the cruelty of the judicial process and the exploitation by the media, agreed with me that we needed to stop this cycle of violence. And so we chose to approach the district attorney and the prosecution and ask them to do a plea agreement for us. Life in prison without parole felt a just punishment.
So what would you say was the overriding lesson that you have learnt as a result of your experience?
I would say that I learned that the death penalty does not serve anyone but itself, that as a society, it's our duty to protect the most vulnerable among us, and that our system does not protect the victims of crime, that it actually perpetuates, compounds the tragedy, and perpetuates the violence.
Mrs. Harrington, I don't suppose there's a person in this room that doesn't feel for what you've just been saying. I think you can take that as read. The plea bargain, which was thrashed out with the district attorney, was that Eric Koppel would serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole.
2 life sentences, sir.
2 life sentences.
Yes.
What do you suppose the chances were, Mrs. Harrington, that Eric Koppel would have accepted a plea to that if he hadn't thought that the alternative was the death sentence?
I'm pretty sure that Eric didn't want to die.
No.
But I also recognize that the death penalty is a symptom of a dysfunctional system. And I'm here today. I've come all the way from Michigan. I've left my congregation to come and say to all of the abolitionists and the people who are for the death penalty that the system needs to be changed, and that there needs to be a victim bill of rights in addition to the abolishment of the death penalty, which, as I said, holds families hostage. It does not meet our needs. We do not want vengeance after we've had a chance to grieve and become healed and find peace. Hatred does not cure hatred.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Paul Cassell, please. Professor Cassell, can we take your CV as read from this booklet, please?
Sounds fine to me.
I think you were counsel for the victims, or some of the victims, in the Timothy McVeigh case in the mid-90s.
I represented 49 of the victims in that case on a pro bono basis, yes.
He was found guilty?
Yes, unanimously by a jury of 12.
And sentenced to death?
Yes, the jury recommended that and the judge imposed that.
There was a bit of a wrinkle earlier as to whether he'd followed through his appeal. Can you help us about that?
He had a full set of appeals, both what we would call in the States a set of direct appeals and a set of collateral challenges. All of his appeals or challenges were rejected by the courts that heard them.
And in the end, did he abandon his appeal?
No, my understanding is that he went through the full process. His appeals were exhausted, however, and he was executed.
Murderers or persons convicted of murder who have been sentenced to imprisonment rather than being executed have subsequently been released on parole.
They have.
And gone on to kill again.
I think if the audience looks at page 35 of the materials, they'll see a photograph of a young woman, Colleen Reed, who was murdered by Kenneth McDuff. He was sentenced to death in 1967 for murdering 2 young boys and a young woman. In 1972, there's been reference to the Furman decision that set aside all death sentences in our country. His death sentence was set aside. Tragically, in 1989, he was released on parole, and in 1991, he killed Colleen Reed and 8 other women in Texas, 9 women that would be alive today had the abolitionists not had their way and abolished the death penalty in our country.
Thank you very much. Could you stay there for a moment, please?
Certainly.
Professor Cassell, I want to ask you about innocence.
I'm certainly in favor of acquitting innocent people. I'm in favor of convicting
Well, that's
guilty.
something. That's something. That's something.
I take it we're all on equal ground there.
Do you think that any system of justice can tolerate even one innocent person being put to death?
The question is one of relative risk, and the risk certainly is greater with abolishing the death penalty than it is with maintaining it.
I don't quite follow what you mean by the risk in Colleen's case. Where is the risk there?
Well, her murderer would have been put to death but for the efforts of abolitionists in our country. And in 1972, they abolished the death penalty, sparing Kenneth McDuff's life. And as a result, he was ultimately paroled and went on to murder Colleen Reed and 8 other women. Had the death penalty been maintained in this country, or my country, through the 1970s, Colleen Reed and 8 other women would be alive today.
Unless he hadn't been paroled.
Well, if he'd been executed, he would not have been paroled. I take that as common ground here.
Let me start again. Unless he was kept in prison so that he could not go out and murder again.
Right, unless he had managed to escape or unless he managed to kill a prison guard, as a number of people have done while serving life without parole sentences.
This is becoming far-fetched, isn't it?
Well, not to the widows of 5 federal prison guards who've been murdered by prisoners serving life without parole sentences. They believe that those prisoners had essentially a license to kill, in that they were already serving a life sentence and no further penalty could be imposed.
Professor, could you help me with this? You represented 49 of the families in McVeigh's case. Did you attend McVeigh's execution?
I did not.
Did they?
My lord, some of them did.
Yes. I see. Have you attended an execution?
I have not, my lord.
Your evidence to the court is that the American death penalty is carefully administered. You haven't actually seen it administered.
I have not, my lord.
Was he killed by lethal injection or by firing squad? Can you remember?
My lord, no state in the United States uses firing squad.
The federal. Well, it is, in fact, to be used by the military commissions in Guantanamo Bay, but that, of course, is a federal matter. You're quite right, no state uses it. Was McVeigh executed by lethal injection in some sort of theater like this?
No, my lord, he was not.
Thank you very much. And my lords, finally I call Robert Blecker, please. Mr. Blecker, you're a professor of law at New York Law School.
Yes, I am.
And we've been discussing this evening is whether or not any fault of the criminal justice system in the United States may be common across the board or not.
Well, the death penalty in the United States is the closest thing we have to a success story in the criminal justice system. There is, in fact, some racism throughout society in every phase of it. There is less in the death penalty system. There's great disparity in the quality of counsel. There's less in the death penalty system. There's disparity in the resources expended. There's less in the death penalty system. It's far from perfect, but it's the closest thing we have to a success story.
You've heard Mr. Cassell deal with deterrence. Is there anything that you want to add on deterrence, particularly with your experience of visiting prisoners themselves over the years?
Yes, I've spent thousands of hours among convicted killers, and they've opened up to me. And I've heard stories. I won't regale you with them, but one particular one was a guy who broke into a house to rob drug dealers and discovered more drugs than he expected. And he had him duct taped and tied up, and he was about to kill him, and he didn't. And I asked him why not and what went through his mind. And he said he remembered looking at the electric chair as a child through the window of the D.C. jail. And he also remembered the time he spent on Richmond Penitentiary when he used to sweep the halls and look at the death at the electric chair. And he said he couldn't tolerate that happening to him, so he let him live, and then that was a half-perfect datum. So I asked him whether he had a similar situation in Washington, D.C., which has no death penalty. He, in fact, had a drug dealer again tied up, and I asked him what did he do, and he said, I killed him. And I asked him why, and he said, because I can tolerate what they've got waiting for me here. I just couldn't tolerate what they had waiting for me in Virginia.
Do you consider that the death penalty for the worst kind of murder is a just and proportionate sentence?
Yes, sometimes it's the only just, sadly, and the only proportionate sentence. There are some people who deserve to die, and we have an obligation to execute them. We have an obligation to carefully figure out who they are. We have an obligation to carefully define who they are in advance. And then we have an obligation, when we find them and determine it, collectively, successively, to kill them.
I wonder if you could wait there one moment, Mr. Blecker.
Mr. Blecker, how do you decide what type of murder warrants the death penalty and what does not?
Well, if you're asking me for my moral code, the essence is cruelty, which the Oxford Unabridged defines as taking extreme pleasure in another's pain or being callously cold about it. If you ask a question collectively, we as a society with our collective sensibility have managed to distinguish the very worst of the worst. They largely include mass murderers, child rapists, sadists, sadly, killers like Eric Koppel.
It's a very arbitrary way of doing it, isn't it?
Hardly. Cross-culturally and over decades, what we find and what significant studies are now finding is that when you present certain fact situations historically and cross-culturally, you will get a remarkable confluence of opinion on what constitutes the worst of the worst. It is not an arbitrary factor. There are some clear monsters.
Do you agree with the rapporteur? It's widely acknowledged that innocent people have likely been sentenced to death and executed.
No, I was recently for an hour on National Public Radio with David Dow, who is the chief capital defender in Houston, in Texas, and he conceded in our hour-long conversation that there has been not one demonstrably innocent person executed in the modern era since Furman has been decided. Not one, demonstrably.
How do you know?
Well, we don't. What we don't, I didn't say there has not, let's be careful. I did not say there has been not been one person innocent who has been executed. I said there has not demonstrably been one. An awful lot of resources have been dedicated by abolitionist organizations to finding one. Time after time, they think they've got one, and time after time, they can't find one.
The fact is, Professor, that the risk of the innocent being convicted is simply too high in the United States, isn't it?
Any risk is too high, but justice doesn't come cheap, and one risks in order to achieve it. And sadly, sometimes the death penalty, and the only death penalty for the worst of the worst of the worst, is the only proportional just response.
I see that you include terrorists among the worst of the worst.
I do, yes.
So you're looking forward to the execution if he's convicted of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed?
I don't know if it will happen, but if it does happen, yes.
Yes, he's looking forward to it enormously too. That's why he's going to plead guilty, because it will provide him, as he thinks, with a pathway to paradise and to all that he hopes to have there. Isn't this ironic? You hate him, and yet he loves you for giving the martyrdom and the fast track to paradise that he so wants.
Well, that's certainly half true. I do hate him. That's undeniable. His love for me still comes with some questions. The fact that he gets what he deserves is what satisfies me. The fact that he gets what he wants does not satisfy me. I suspect that as it gets closer, you're going to find that he doesn't really want that. He wants to go out as a martyr, but being executed is not the way they generally want to go out.
Well, the last way he wants to go out is in 50 years' time in a prison farm in upstate New York.
Well, as someone who has spent thousands of hours examining what daily life is like for those who are sentenced to life without parole, I'm appalled by the fact that those who deserve it most suffer least inside. The lifers have the best jobs. Their day-to-day life is the most privileged. They have the best sources for drugs. They have the best sources for sex. They have the best, they have the most pleasures in life, and those who deserve it least suffer the most. They are the most vulnerable. And so as a retributivist who fundamentally wants to connect crime with punishment, what appalls me most about the criminal justice system is just the kinds of conditions in upstate New York that he's most likely to face if he is in fact in life without parole. He will be put in a segregated unit where he will not be threatened, and he will be given all sorts of privileges.
But he won't go to the paradise that he wants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And, my lords, that's the case for the defense.
Members of the jury, attitudes to the death penalty are emotional. What then gives another nation the right to indict that nation for perverting the course of justice? Not, you may think, the first three grounds of this indictment, but if you look at particular four, that raises one issue that you may think could trump the democratic decision, namely whether an act is inhuman. Even were it demonstrated that capital punishment had a deterrent effect, the question for you is whether that effect can justify the setting of a grisly example by a justice system which should be committed to promoting the values of humanity. The mistake, you may think, is to use the legal system in an attempt to dignify killing by the state. The issue for you is whether you think that the legal system, the court-approved death penalty, is wrong, a system which is committed to the righting of wrongs. Can it be used to perpetuate a killing? At the end of the day, your vote may depend on whether you agree or disagree with what John Bright said as long ago as 1850, if you wish to teach the people to reverence human life, you must first show that you reverence it yourself.
Well, we now come to the time when you have to give your a verdict, and we have to deal with that in a rather broad way. And I think that what we will do is ask, first of all, those who consider that the United States death penalty is guilty of the offense. If you do, would you hold up your hand? Yes. Yes. Well, let's now say that with those who say the United States death penalty is not guilty, hold up their hands. It's overwhelming. I think on that basis, the guilt has been established by a great majority, with no minimum majority which is required, and undoubtedly there are many more who are in favor of guilt than innocence. Thank you.